Hey guys, welcome to our first online lecture this semester. And in case you haven't taken an online course before, and especially in case you haven't taken one in a shortened semester like we have now, I really want you to approach all of our topics this semester with a little more intently, with a little more intensity. So as you watch this, if you have any questions at all, if there's anything at all you do not understand, please go ahead and write that down. Shoot it to me in an email or a text, and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. So all of the content that we learn this semester, it builds on the next set of content. So just like when you were learning math, you learned to count, then addition, then subtraction, then multiplication, things build. So if you miss one of these foundational concepts, then really it's going to hurt you for the rest of the class. So what we're going to talk about today is just what is an essay in general. And the essay that we define today is the type of essay you're going to write the entire semester. So for the next several weeks, each time you write an essay, it should do what an essay does. And that essay we're talking about is the one we're defining today. So I do just want to mention that there are lots of different approaches to writing an essay, and you may have had a teacher in the past or a teacher in the future who is going to show you a different approach. And that's great. There's lots of different valid approaches. So what I'm going to teach you is the approach that I think you should use. So most of you guys are, you're not seasoned writers. Some of you may be good writers, but most of you don't have professional experience. So these are just kind of tips and tricks to get you going if you're not accustomed to writing college level essays. So let's get started with that. If you're watching this, then you have found your way into Module 1, and there's a PowerPoint presentation there called What is an Essay? It's your Module 1 lecture notes. So you need to have that open if you don't already, and I'm just going to walk you through slide by slide. So if you want to leave this video running in the background while you click through your slides, that could be a really great way to do this. So I'm going to be taking you through slide by slide. So I'm going to go ahead and click on slide 2 after our title slide. So before you can write anything, you need to know what it is you're going to write. Or before you write a letter, it helps to know you're going to write a letter, or an email that you're going to write an email, or a text, because those different types of writing have different standards, right? So a letter doesn't look like an email usually. It doesn't look like a text. They're all different. The same is true with an essay. An essay has certain characteristics, and I want you guys to follow those characteristics every time you turn an essay into me. Okay, so an essay is a collection of sentences that all work together to prove one central point. So this semester, that is what we're going to be doing. We're only going to be writing argument essays. So in an argument essay, you make a claim that something is true or untrue, or you argue that something's better than something else. And so all of the sentences that you write in your essay will work together to prove that one central point. All right? So you'll also see there that the way we're going to organize those sentences is into 5 specific types of paragraphs. So the first paragraph is always the introduction. The next 3 paragraphs are your body paragraphs. So we have body paragraph 1, 2, and 3. And then your last paragraph, so that 5th paragraph in your 5-paragraph essay, is your conclusion. That is always the case. So you're going to write some essays for me that are about 500 words. You'll have 5 paragraphs. The last essay you write for me will be a longer essay. It will still only have 5 paragraphs. Those paragraphs will just be developed further. So it's always true no matter what type of essay you're writing for me. Okay, so let's look at these paragraphs one at a time. So click the next slide. Your first paragraph type is the introduction. So you always have the introduction first. I have a lot of students who have a hard time writing the introduction until they've written the body paragraphs, and that makes sense, right? So how can you introduce something when you don't know what that something is yet? So when you write, you may want to go ahead and write the paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 first, and then go back and write the introduction after that. And that should make sense to you in a little while after we talk about what those other paragraphs do. So your introduction does what it says it does, right? It introduces your essay. So since we're always going to be working toward proving just one point in our essays, you want to make sure your introduction just comes right out and says what that point is. So a lot of the way you organize an essay is to orient the reader, right? So that the reader's not confused. So when I read your essay, I will expect for the introduction to do a few things, right? So one of the things it does is tells me what the paper is going to be about, right? So that sentence that tells me what that central point is, that sentence is called the thesis statement. I'm sure you've heard of that before, right? So your thesis statement typically comes as the last sentence of your introduction paragraph. It doesn't have to, but that's just typically how it happens. Okay, so let's talk about what the introduction does other than, how does it tell me what the paper is going to be about? What does it do? So other than having that thesis statement at the end of the paragraph, the other sentences leading up to that sentence, they typically are going to work to provide some context for me. So what is the topic? Do I need to have some background information? That kind of thing. And also to just get my attention, to get me interested in what I'm going to read. So let's click over to the next slide, and I'm going to show you an example. So this is an actual introduction paragraph from a student essay from past semesters. So let's take a look at that paragraph and then see what you think about it, okay? So remember that we need the introduction to grab our attention and to give me the central claim, right? The thesis statement of the essay. So let's just read this here. In Michael Pollan's essay, Why Bother?, he claims most individuals do not spend their time with environmental issues. In the article, Pollan suggests that going green may be a suitable way of living life. To go green means to make an effort to improve efficiency and to reduce the pollution produced in a business, an individual's home, or the overall way of living. I do not agree with this statement. While going green could be a great idea, if an individual is not educated on how effectively to farm, he will waste money and time. The disadvantages of going green are the primary cost, inadequate savings, and the competition. Okay, so if you need to pause this video for a second and read that introduction paragraph a few times back to yourself, I want you to evaluate this paragraph. So think about the characteristics we just talked about and ask yourself, does this paragraph do that? And then once you're ready to go to the next slide, then you can unpause and we'll take a look at that. Okay, so now you're at the next slide, and you can see that I have labeled the parts of this introduction paragraph to kind of give you a more specific idea of what has been done here. So for the purposes of our course, this is a good introduction. It has all three parts we talked about, right? It lets us know what exactly to expect in the essay. It's given us context, gotten our attention, those three things, right? So you can see how I've color coded those. So I've put the context in kind of that pink color, the attention grabber in green, and then the thesis in blue. So look at what's in pink there. That's context. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means she gave us some background information, right? What are we arguing about here? Well, we're arguing about this article that this guy wrote, and he made this specific point that people should go green. So that's our context. And then what's my attention grabber? Well, I kind of perked up. I don't know about you, but when she said, I don't agree with what he said, right? I mean, it could be a good idea, but I don't agree. So that kind of got my attention, right? So when you say, well, my mom told me that if I ever want to find a boyfriend who's worth anything, I need to find somebody who treats his mother well. But I don't agree with that. As soon as you say that, I'm thinking, what are you going to say next, right? You have my attention now. So that can be a really effective attention grabber. And then in the blue, you see she specifically said what her central point is. The disadvantages of going green are primary cost, inadequate savings, and competition. So there are improvements that can be made to this, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But this is basically a good introduction. It's got all of our elements. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So we've talked about what the introduction is, right? That's your first paragraph. So what do the body paragraphs do? So those are our three paragraphs that follow the introduction. And the only thing they should ever do is explain, support, and prove your thesis. Okay? So if you keep that in mind and you really try to discipline yourself to only do that, then you'll typically have a great essay. So let's take a little closer look at the thesis, because the thesis always dictates what our body paragraphs are about. So you can see, remember her thesis talked about the disadvantages of going green. There were three disadvantages she listed: primary costs, inadequate savings, and competition. Right? So those three items, cost, savings, competition, those are her 3 points. So each essay you're going to write for me is going to have 3 points in the thesis statement. Always, always, always. And each of those points lines up with one of your body paragraphs, and you do it in order. So her first body paragraph is going to talk about primary costs. Her second body paragraph is going to talk about inadequate savings, and her third is going to talk about the competition. So that's all the body paragraphs do. So body paragraphs should always, in the first sentence of your body paragraph, you should state what your topic is for that paragraph. And since your topic is one of those points from the thesis, it's basically a restatement of one of those. So she's going to do that in the first sentence of her body paragraph, and then every sentence after that in that paragraph is it can only exist to explain or support the point, the topic sentence. Okay? So let's click to the next slide, and we're going to take a look at that. Okay? So again, I'm going to let you read this paragraph to yourself for a second and ask yourself, is this a good body paragraph or not? So remember our criteria, right? The first sentence needs to state the point, and that point should match back up to our thesis. And then every other sentence after that needs to support that point. So I'll give you a second to do that. I'm going to pause for a second, and then we'll move on. Okay, so you can see on the next slide, label the parts. I've broken this down into two colors. So a body paragraph should only have two parts. So in pink, the topic sentence that restates one of the points from the thesis. And then in green, all the rest of the sentences should explain, support, and prove that point. So let's look at her paragraph here. So you see what I've highlighted in pink. The first disadvantage of going green is the primary cost. Well, there you go. That's your topic sentence. It stated your point, right? So it didn't just randomly say something about primary cost. It stated her argument, right? So the first disadvantage is primary cost. So we know that in this paragraph, she's going to try to convince us that this is a disadvantage. Okay? And then all those sentences in green after that first sentence, they are all explaining, supporting, and proving her claim that primary cost is a problem going green. All right? So that's going to be true for all three of your body paragraphs. The first sentence will always be your topic sentence, and it should make a claim, right? And then all the sentences after it should prove that claim. Okay, next slide. So since I've been teaching this class for a while, this is my 11th year, I have noticed that there are common mistakes that students make, and there's not that many common mistakes. There's just a lot of mistakes that fall into these few categories. So I'm going to go ahead and, even before you get started, point out what those are. So three mistakes I commonly see in a body paragraph. The first mistake is that you don't put your topic sentence as the first sentence. So the reason that's a problem is that, again, you're orienting your reader to what's going to be said. So it's just not clear to me what your paragraph is trying to do if you don't have that topic sentence as your first sentence. So please always do that. The second common error is that you have sentences in that paragraph that don't support your topic sentence, right? When you're reading back through your papers before you turn them in to me, if you come across a sentence in your body paragraph that does not directly support your topic sentence, you need to go ahead and delete it. And a lot of times it can be tempting to not want to delete because you're trying to meet that word count, but don't do that. I mean, the whole point of the sentences you put in is only to explain, support, right, to lend credibility to your claim. So if your sentences don't do that, you've got to get rid of them. And the third common mistake is that as you're going along in your paragraph, instead of just sticking to that one point that you're supposed to talk about in your paragraph, write that one topic sentence, that you start drifting off and talking about other points that your paper's making in other places. So you don't want to do that. The job of a paragraph is to discuss one concept at a time. It's a basic unit of writing, if you want to think of it that way. So one paragraph should talk about green, and it should only talk about green. If the next paragraph talks about blue, it shouldn't also talk about green, right? Just the green paragraph talks about green. Just the blue paragraph talks about blue, if you want to think of it in those terms. So, of course, all these paragraphs work together to support the larger idea, the thesis, but they shouldn't talk about each other, right? So they just talk about their individual points per paragraph. So hopefully that's a helpful way for you to think about it. All right, let's click the next slide, the conclusion. It's been my experience that this is the hardest paragraph for most students to write. And I think mostly because once you make it through your introduction and your 3 body paragraphs, you really feel like you've said all there is to say about your topic, right? You've told me your main point, and then you've explained your 3 supporting points, given all the reasons those are valid, and you think, well, there's nothing left to say about that. But here's the problem, and here's why we don't ask you guys to write 4 paragraph essays. If you have an introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and then you stop, it feels like you're not finished, right? And you've seen this in movies or in songs. There's usually something at the end that kind of unifies it all, ties it all together. And that's what a conclusion paragraph is, right? So it's in ceremonies, right? We have a graduation ceremony. We don't just call it everybody's name and then leave, right? You usually have somebody get back up there and wrap it all up for you, or at church that happens, or just, so we're just used to that way of thinking, that way of experiencing, and an essay is no different. So don't forget about the conclusion, right? So your introduction is my first impression of your essay. Your conclusion is my last impression of your essay. That's the last thing I read before I grade your paper. So don't forget about it. I have a few tips for you here for a good conclusion. A good conclusion will do 2 things. It'll provide the reader with some kind of closure, right? So I don't feel like I'm just hanging. You provide me some closure to it. And the second thing it'll do, if it's a really good conclusion, it'll help me to think about what the essay has said in some kind of broader way, right? So when you're in a speech class, sometimes people call this your call to action, right? So I've told you all these things, and based on this, here's what I want you to do. Conclusions can do the same thing. So let's look at what bad conclusions do. Bad conclusions just repeat what you've already said, right? So you're tired, you don't want to think of new content, you're just going to tell me, just repeat the thesis, just summarize what you've already said, or just talk about something completely unrelated because you're trying to get words on the page. Those are not good techniques for conclusion, so please don't do any of that. Let's look at an example. Next slide. So I've put here for you the conclusion from the essay we've been looking at. So I want you to take a look at that, take a second to read it, and then ask yourself, what are the strengths or weaknesses of this conclusion? And then I want you to pause me for a second, do that, and then come back. Okay, so if you read through that, it should sound familiar to you. And the reason it should sound familiar to you is because this conclusion is almost an exact repeat of the introduction, right? So that's something we don't want to do, something we talked about not doing. So if you were going to tell this person what to do, how to strengthen this, what could she say? So just go ahead and click on the next slide. I have written a revised conclusion, and there's lots of different ways we could revise this. But when you think about what you want a conclusion to do, and I've got it here in color coded again, 2 things. In green, I have providing closure, and in pink, I have causing the reader to think beyond the essay itself. So in green, how do we provide closure? Well, we do refer back to what we've said without summarizing. We refer back to it and kind of try to tidy it up, wrap up the loose ends. So I've said here, in conclusion, while Pollan does honestly seek to improve the environment by asking everyone to go green, his ideas are not grounded in reality. Most people do not have the knowledge, time, or money to affect real environmental change in the ways he suggests. So you see, I didn't go back through and re-argue my points. I just kind of gave a nice broad, just kind of tidying up, wrapping up. And then in pink, I've shifted to try to cause you to think beyond what you've already thought. Even though pollen solutions are not effective, we should all still make environmentally friendly choices where we can, using the time, money, and knowledge at our disposal to make the world a better place. So that's kind of my call to action. So, it's not super long, and your conclusions and introductions don't need to be super long. 4 or 5 sentences is fine as long as those are well developed. So there you go. Not super difficult if you keep in mind what you're trying to do. So I really do want you, when you get to the point in the semester where you're sitting down to write an essay, please come back to this lecture, to these slides, and look and see, now, what did Miss Basham say a good introduction does? And make sure yours does that. What did she say good body paragraphs do? Conclusion. Just make sure they do that, right? So that's the whole point of this. Okay, so next slide, let's talk about our thesis. So remember I said your introduction paragraphs, that first paragraph, the last sentence of that first paragraph should always be your thesis statement. And so if you'll remember, the thesis statement is that sentence that tells me what the point of the entire essay is. So it is critical that you always have a good thesis statement. So let's look at what a good thesis statement is. So I have 4 characteristics here. First of all, it states your position. So as I mentioned earlier, all the essays we're going to be writing are argument essays. So your position is going to be that you agree or disagree with someone, or that you believe something. So you're trying to persuade or convince me to agree with you, or to at least consider something different than what I've already considered. So you're going to state your position, and you're going to state it clearly. You don't need to feel shy. Sometimes I have writers, your natural personality is not just to come out and say what you think. You need to come out and say what you think in an argument essay, right? And not in a rude way, of course, but you just need to come out and say, I believe, and then tell me what you believe, or I disagree, and then tell me why. So you don't have to be shy about it. So it states your position. That's the first thing a good thesis does. The second thing it does is that it states your 3 points. It is 1 sentence long, and it appears in your introduction almost always at the end. So you've got 1 sentence that has your position and your 3 points, okay? So a bad thesis, there's 2 pages in your book, your writer's reference book, that discuss what bad thesis statements do. And it doesn't only tell you what the mistakes are, but it also shows you ways to fix that. So I've just referenced those 2 pages here in our lecture. So you can go and take a look at those. They are super helpful. Okay, so next slide. Let's look at our example. So again, I've put the introduction paragraph here for you. And I want you to try to find the thesis statement in this paragraph if you can. So go ahead and read through it. And once you find that thesis statement, I want you to ask yourself if it meets those 4 criteria we just talked about. And if it doesn't, what would you do to make that happen? So I'll give you a second to do that, and then you can unpause and we'll keep going. Okay, so most of you probably guessed that the last sentence of that paragraph was the thesis statement, and that's true, but you might have a hard time spotting it because it didn't really fulfill all the criteria that we need it to for a good thesis. So it did list 3 points, but it wasn't really clear what the position was. And if you looked, you probably noticed that she split that up across the last couple of sentences, and I don't want you to do that. I want those 2, the position and points, to always be there in the same sentence. So I've revised it for you, and in blue, my revised version has the position, and then in yellow it has the 3 points. So here's my new thesis. Paulin is wrong when he says that going green is a good way to live because most people face overwhelming disadvantages to going green. So that was my position. I've told you what I thought. Now I'm going to give you the 3 reasons I think it, including primary cost, inadequate savings, and competition. So in this thesis statement, when you read this, you should be able to clearly see what the paper is going to be about, right? So when I see this on your paper, I think, oh, well, so in these next 3 body paragraphs, this person's going to be explaining to me how primary cost, inadequate savings, and competition are going to keep me from going green, right? There's such large disadvantages that I won't even try it. Okay? All right. So let's move on to our next slide. We're getting close. We're almost done. How do I write a clear thesis statement? So the reason we're spending a little extra time on the thesis is that it's the touchstone of your essay. It's the foundation. It's the most important part of your essay. So I often tell students, think about your thesis as your GPS, right? It's that address that you put into your GPS. A GPS is if you get in your car and you want to go to your best friend from college's house, right? She just moved into this new house and you want to go there. but you don't have the address to put in the GPS. You're going to have a really hard time getting there because you don't know where you're going. The thesis is that address, right? It lays down for you, here's where I want to go. And then the rest of your essay gets us there. Okay, so we're going to spend a little extra time talking about that. So I've got 3 points here to help you write a clear thesis. First of all, you want to directly refer to what you agree or disagree with. So this is kind of what I talked about you not being afraid to be direct. So I have an example here. I agree with Trump that a wall along the southern border is the best solution to border insecurity. Okay, so that the first part of my thesis, right, that's the first half of the sentence there. I came right out and said I agreed. And I said what I agreed with, right? So, by the way, that's an example. That may or may not be my actual political position. But I thought that was something you guys could all relate to, right? This is a common topic people discuss these days. So that first part in yellow there, it shows you exactly what my position is in a direct way. I directly stated that I agreed. And that's what I need you to do, okay? The next point, to have a clear thesis, you need to state your 3 points at the end of your position after a transition word, like the word because. That's an easy one, right? So let's take that same sentence. I agree with Trump that a wall on the southern border is the best solution to border insecurity because it is cost efficient, it's an effective physical border, and it is needed support to Border Patrol personnel. So before I list my 3 reasons, I have that transition word that shows you I believe this because this. Okay? And then the third point for a clear thesis, make sure your list of 3 items is parallel. It's grammatically parallel. So you can see I've highlighted for you here my 3 phrases, my lists start with it is. It is this, it is that, it is this. And you can find more about this in section S1A in your writer's reference book. It can take you through some different examples of grammatical parallelism. So that may sound like a nitpicky thing that I'm saying there, but when you look at sentences that are not grammatically parallel, even if you're not an English teacher like I am, you read them and they're very confusing. So just do that. And it's something in speech that we do a lot of times, but when we sit down to write, sometimes we forget to do that. And if you come across a list like that where it's not grammatically parallel, it's very difficult to understand. It's unclear. So just keep that in mind and see that section in your book for more help with that. Okay, so now that I've told you about the 5 paragraphs in your 5-paragraph essay, you should be ready to write an essay, right? No. No, you shouldn't. And the next slide addresses this. How do you get started? So I can't just tell you, here's what a thesis is. Here's how your 5 paragraphs should be organized. Good luck, go write an essay. Because you have no inspiration. You have no, what we might call, you might have heard this term in high school, exigence, right? What is it that makes me want to write? Right? Why should I write about this? What is going on here? What am I writing about? So one of the ways you become motivated to write in this class, this is what we'll always do. We are going to read something that will get us thinking about a topic, and then we're going to write about that same topic. Okay, so I'm going to always give you, it might be a short reading, a little bit longer reading, but it's going to be something that gets you thinking before you write. So you might think, well, I'm not sure that's going to help me because I might read what you've assigned and it's boring to me. And so I still don't care about it.